one of the understandings of RWJ Health Policy Fellow Program is that they should not show their politics. They had to be politically neutral. I mean, they were going to just contribute to the work, but not to the politics.
I had no trouble at all working with people with whom I disagreed. We had a good time doing it. We were also allowed to disagree, and we were allowed to express our opinions, and people respected that.
And at that time, of course, there was so much bipartisanship. Your best friend worked for a Republican or Democrat if you were a Republican. So, those were in a way the golden days.
Everyone, Republicans and Democrats, all knew health was the big issue. So you had this sense of possibility that these issues and these problems and these things that we had all studied could be made better. So it was a very optimistic time.
The senator I worked for wanted everything to be bipartisan, and he worked very hard to work with everybody else in the Senate. There wasn't so much of a split in terms of the parties, and we could communicate Democrats and Republicans.
I think I was in a transitional period in terms of going from the old, what is regarded as relative comedy, to today, which seems to be more toxic. My sense was when I watched the members, and to a degree the staff, but particularly the members, they worked well in private. But when you turned on the camera for C-SPAN or an interview, it was like a different person because they had a role to play.
I worked on bipartisan issues. I have an academic interest in quality of care and have done a lot of research in that area. And so there was the whole MACRA thing about trying to pay for quality and value of care rather than simply pay for delivering care. And that was very bipartisan. All the groups that we met, there were those of us who worked in that area. It really was very collaborative.
So we passed this MACRA bill. That had been this, secret thing between Pelosi and Boehner and her staffs. So they were obviously speaking and working collaboratively. And the day that the bill passed, we were back in her office celebrating. It was also her 75th birthday, which was amazing. And she was on the phone with John Boehner. And they were congratulating each other that they had gotten this passed. He obviously must have wished her happy birthday. And at the end of the call, she said, "I love you too." And she hung up. And I thought, oh my God, they must really have regard for one another. She's a straight shooter. She wouldn't say, she's not fake that way. She wouldn't say, "I loved you too," if she wasn't really meaning it, right? So it was a wonderful, the whole experience was a wonderful example of how you could be bipartisan.
We have people placed on both sides of the aisle, and we bring an objective, data-based, data-informed background to that. And I feel I was able to do that with also understanding partisan politics. It's not like we were naive to that and don't understand those impacts of it. But I feel I was able to show a newer office to the fellowship, that we come with the desire to learn, with our own expertise and background, and that we can be helpful to those offices coming from this fellowship.
Ron Kind was really intentional about working across the aisle. He was a very moderate Democrat. That was important to me. And I think that's something that I found to be most meaningful, is that really good policy comes from both sides of the aisle, and that when it is effective, it's when everyone is working together. And you don't get to see that. You don't see that in the media. It's not something that's really well spoken, and people don't talk about it, but that's ultimately how the work gets done. And it was interesting to be in the room when we were sort of hashing out where everyone was willing to meet in the middle.
A lot of what I saw was actually in the leadership at the staff level. So like my boss, Wendell Primus, would meet with his corollary staff in the Senate and the House, Republican and Democrat. And the four of them would periodically get together to try to agree on what do we each want, what do we think we could move forward, what kind of compromises are we each willing to make.
I certainly saw a lot of bipartisan cooperation, which was admittedly very surprising considering what we see in the media. I was helping with a particular piece of legislation relating to mental health. It was a big package. There were lots of side conversations among staff in particular that then got relayed to the Republican folks on the committee, the Democrats on the committee, in ways that you would never have seen in the media. They weren't videotaped, they weren't part of hearings. And so a lot of cooperation and compromise happened kind of behind the scenes. And also sometimes right before, during, or after a hearing. But again, these weren't things that were on camera. So that was really interesting to see.
Some of the political thoughts on both extremes are just both interesting and entertaining. And I think I learned a lot across the political spectrum, so I enjoyed that part of it.
At a high level, bipartisanship is so important, both for the fellowship, but just in general for the functioning of policy and politics. Unfortunately, right now, bipartisanship is not as active as it has been in the past. Since the pandemic, I learned in my placement there's been much less collaboration, at least in the House. Unfortunately, the environment right now is that there's very little collaboration. And as a fellow, that I think how that trickles down is it makes it harder for fellows to consider the full spectrum of placements politically, because there's this assumption that whoever you work for reflects your own beliefs. And so that, one, can be hard to even get a placement with someone who might not fully match your beliefs because they may not want you. But if you do get that placement, you then may be expected to only work on things that exactly mirror the member's interests. And then finally, if you do work in a member office or a committee that is not aligned with your own personal political beliefs, it could make it harder for you to get a policy job down the road for the other side, whatever that side is, because people will see you worked for that person and assume things about your beliefs. One hopeful nugget here is that legislation that has passed the House this past year has been because of bipartisanship. The Republicans held a very narrow majority. The more moderate Democrats did vote with the Republicans and were able to pass all the basic legislation we needed, from the budget to reauthorization of several key bills. I'm hopeful that with the right leaders in place over time, that culture will reemerge.
It's very noticeable, the partisan nature. Yes, this is a nonpartisan fellowship, and we're encouraged to work across the aisle. So that's one of the things that I'm learning is how to work across the aisle. You can't help but notice how hyperpolarized politics can be at the federal level. And so that is a skill set. I think I've learned it in academics, and which is quite similar, and I'm learning that now and perfecting it here in DC, and really is that how to work across the aisle.